All right, so hi everybody. Thank you so much for coming to watch this. I'm like super excited and super happy. And just a brief introduction about myself. So I write children's books, and that's from very little children to like older children. I'm also an illustrator. This is some of the work that I've done. I have a degree in biology, and I was born in Brazil from German and Polish ancestors, and I now live in Austin, Texas. And I just want to make sure that y'all know I'm not a historian, so like you can't like sue me for anything that I say that's not that may not be you know super controversial, or that may be super controversial or something like that. And I also do want to say that I have in the book that I've written, which is this book here, I researched it for 5 to 6 years, and it's a historical fiction, but it has a lot of history in it and a lot of pictures of documents, and I really tried to base it on the history. And I did take an approach to it which is not the most conventional historical view on Asser Levy, because a lot of people went to them by Captain de la Motte, who was a French captain sailing back to Canada and offered for a very high price to drop them off in New Amsterdam, which was a Dutch colony. So they took him up on his offer, and they had very little money to pay him, but they all pooled their money together and gave him whatever they had, with the intention of paying him the rest when they arrived in New Amsterdam. And on September 7th, 1654, the St. Catherine, which is La Motte's ship, which is this ship here, it's a painting of the ship, arrives in New Amsterdam, and we can see the passengers getting on the little rowboats and rowing to shore. And also what you can see here in the back is another ship, which is called the Pear Boom, or the Pear Tree, which was a ship that arrived just a few days before this one. And we'll talk about that later also, because there were some Jewish people who were on that ship as well. This is what New Amsterdam looked like back then. It's a painting, and this is what we would be seeing in the same view today. And here's another view of New Amsterdam, and you can see the windmill, the Dutch Reformed Church, the fort. These paintings are by Lem Tentillo, who is an expert painter of New Netherlands. Okay, so just on a side here, I'm a very visual person, and I like to picture what that Captain de la Motte might have looked like. And I found this painting, and it's not him. And this is a painting of a Dutch captain from around the same time period, and he's a very famous captain. But you know, he might have looked somewhat like this.
If I may say,
Yes.
This is Michiel de Ruiter, a famous admiral in the Netherlands. Among other things, he sailed up the Thames and threatened to capture London for the Dutch.
Okay, and for my slide, he serves as a visual for La Motte, so just so you can kind of act the story out in your head. But as soon as these 23 Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, the La Motte realized that they would not be able to pay the rest of the fare that they were owed, and he immediately ran to court and sued them. And even though it's a horrible thing, like, because he did this, like, we actually know that this story happened the way it did. Like, any information we have from when they landed in New Amsterdam is on these lawsuits that went on for months between these Jews and Captain de la Motte. But what he says here is that they had paid in solidum, which means they paid as a lump sum, not individually, and that he would be able to sell their property would be publicly sold in auction if they didn't pay, and that this man, Solomon Peterson, who was also a Jew, was their attorney in court, and that there were 23 souls, big and little. That means 23 adults and 23 adults and children. And they had 2 days to be able to pay before consequences happened. And I'm not going to go too much more into the lawsuit because that's a whole different story, but you know, you can see the details of the story in this lawsuit. And Solomon Peterson was one of the Jews that arrived on the other ship in the back, the Paraboom. During this whole lawsuit period, just a few days after they landed, there was the first Rosh Hashanah, and because there were now you know, more than 10 men surely in New Amsterdam who could form a minyan, they surely celebrated the first Rosh Hashanah in North America. And the antagonist of our story is Peter Stuyvesant, who was the Director General of New Netherlands, and that means he was like the governor. And he was not happy with the arrival of these 23 refugee Jews, and sort of actively was trying to get them deported. And these are some of the words that were used from Peter Stuyvesant's letters that he sent to the West India Company, and some of the letters that other important people in the government of New Amsterdam wrote. So you can see like they were not like very welcome there, even though there were people of many religions in New Amsterdam, like the Jews were not. Those 23 Jewish refugees were not welcome.
May I add here that one of those words, or two of them, obstinate and immovable, refers to the refusal to become Christians, to be converted in any way.
Yeah.
Because they did not do so, they were obstinate.
Yes, and Ton has told me that these words come up a lot in different documents, and it's a reference to that refusal to convert. And the Jews decided to fight for their rights. So, and they had rights because the Dutch government gave them religious freedom rights and citizen rights. So they wrote to the West India Company in January of 1655, and this document is in a museum in Philadelphia. And what basically it says, you can read all of these if you want, but basically it says, we were in Recife, we fought on the side of the Dutch, and we died for them there. All our things were taken from us. We are poor now. We are loyal to the West India Company. We pay taxes to the West India Company. You know, you should want us to stay here and help develop this place and pay taxes and colonize. And the Dutch West India Company wrote back and said, he wrote back to Peter Stuyvesant sort of saying, well, you know, we understand your situation, but we observe that it would be unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained to the Jews in the taking of Brazil, and because they've invested so much of their money in this company, that they have permission to sail and trade in New Netherlands and to live and remain there, provided they do not become a burden to the company. So they were given permission to stay. Now that didn't, sorry, I'll go back here. That didn't change Stuyvesant's mind, and he continued to make life very difficult for the Jews. Like if he can't like legally deport them, he's going to make them want to deport themselves, which is something that we've seen in the world today as well. In 1655, we see a number of Jews arriving from Amsterdam to New Amsterdam to sort of help establish the Jewish colony there. And they were Sephardic Jews who were, you know, well off and influential people. And this man, Abraham de Lucena, even brought with him a Torah. Now, it's not necessarily a picture of the Torah that he brought, but this is sort of what they looked like back then, so you can have a visual. And how do we know this happened? Well, there's a couple of documents, but this is one that Ton also found for me. And it's actually from when Abraham de Lucena returned to Amsterdam with the Torah. And it says here that he had brought the Sefer Torah back with him. There's his name, Abraham de Lucena, and that he had brought the Torah back from New Amsterdam. So it came and then it went back eventually. Oh, well, after Peter Stuyvesant continued making the life of Jews very difficult there, they sent a second petition to the West India Company saying that Peter Stuyvesant had obeyed their orders. And in 1656, the West India Company finally writes to Peter Stuyvesant and tells him he has been a very bad boy, and says, "We have seen and heard with displeasure that against our orders, you have forbidden the Jews to trade and to purchase real estate. We wish it had not been done and that you had obeyed our orders, and you must treat them quietly and leniently and let them have religious exercises in their house." Okay, so that settled that once and for all. And these are all the rights that the Jews fought for between, the time when they arrived and this difficult period of being accepted there. So first they petitioned for the right to stay. Then they demanded their citizen rights. They demanded the right to work, travel, and trade. They demanded the right to serve in the military. They petitioned for the right to not have to work in the Sabbath and the Shabbat. They fought for their rights to buy property. They fought for a right to have a kosher butcher. They fought for a Jewish burial ground, and they formed the first Jewish congregation in North America. This is a drawing of the first building of the Shearith Israel congregation, which is the one formed by these 23 Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent. It was on Mill Street, and it was built in 1730. That was already during the British period. And this is a picture of what the synagogue looks like today. This is Zachary Edinger. He works at Shearith Israel, and this is my daughter when we toured the synagogue, and she's holding a very valuable, little piece of history in her hand and doesn't realize it. And all of these Torah ornaments are from the synagogue in the original 1730 synagogue, Shearith Israel. And this flame down here has been burning since the opening of the synagogue, which was during Passover, I believe it was opened. And these stones that you see here are the mill stones from the mill on Mill Street, which is where the synagogue was. And those are all inside Shearith Israel building today. The oldest Jewish cemetery in New York is still around. It's called the Chatham Square Cemetery. It's from 1656. And on the corner here, you can see the name of some of the Jews that fought for the right to have a burial ground. And this is the oldest grave right here. And it belongs to Benjamin Bueno de Mesquita, who had once lived in Recife and died in 1683. This is the Castello plan, the redrawn Castello plan, which is a wonderful, wonderful map of New Amsterdam that has each and every house and yard and tree that existed at the time. It has a lot of detail. And this square area here enlarged is right here on the right, and the arrow points to this house right here, which was Asser Levy's house. And that's possibly what it looked like. And this is a document that shows when he was given permission to buy the lot to build his house on. And down here in the bottom, you see a picture of the corner of Mill and South William Street. And that's where, I'm sorry, that's where the house, right near that corner, is where his house was. Asser Levy, who is a very well-known figure in New York and the sort of hero of my story, was the first Jew to be granted citizen rights in America, 1657. He was the first kosher butcher in America from 1660. He was the first Jewish homeowner, and he became one of the wealthiest men in New York. He worked as a merchant, a real estate developer, an attorney, a money lender, and when he died in 1682, there were over 400 New Yorkers who owed him money. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the controversy of Asser Levy. So the big controversy is whether he came on the St. Catherine with the Jews from Brazil, or whether he came on the Pear Tree, which was the other ship from Amsterdam. And, you know, I want you to know that most of the contemporary historians believe he and Jacob Bar Simon and, what's the other guy's name? That the attorney, those three were the ones who arrived in the Pear Tree. And and I want you to know that there is no documentation that proves that Asser Levy was on either ship. It's all just conjecture. It's all just a matter of opinion. The historians believe that Asser Levy, being an Ashkenazi Jew and, you know, having ended up staying in New Amsterdam while the other ones eventually left, and, you know, having been such a successful businessman, like, wasn't really a part of that group. But from my view and the research that I did, I have I found 3 lawsuits that kind of place Asser Levy with the St. Catherine and the Lamotte story. So, and he may have learned how to be a butcher from his father, which may have been Benjamin Levy in Brazil, although that we really don't know for sure. The first lawsuit is between Captain Lamotte and Asser Levy. Lamotte sues Asser Levy for freight that Levy owned him. And Levy claims that his goods were sold at auction along with the other Jews, and therefore his debt was paid. The second lawsuit is between Levy and Ricky Nunes. And Ricky Nunes was a woman, and she was on the St. Catherine. And the lawsuit was for a loan that he made to her for buying a waistcoat in a place called Gamanica, which we don't know where it is, but it may have been an incorrect spelling of Jamaica. And the third lawsuit is between Ricky Nunes and Asser Levy again. And she's saying that she paid for his freight from the West Indies and that their goods were sold at auction. So those 3 lawsuits make me think that he had been in the West Indies, which was how what the Caribbean was called back then, with the passengers of the St. Catherine. And he, you know, was paying freight to the captain, like he was involved in that whole lawsuit. And just to sort of finish off, I wanted to say some of the challenges that I faced when I was researching this story, like not being a historian and, you know, trying to find out what the facts really were. And, you know, I'm Brazilian, and I don't mean to like say bad things about Brazil, but working in Brazil is very difficult. There's always a lot of obstacles, and it was very hard to reach people by emails. They often don't reply to emails or phone calls. The archives in Recife were in pretty precarious condition. And the reason it says story here is I just wanted to say a story that that Dr. Bruno Miranda, who is the man who you saw in the picture going through those boxes in Recife, when he was a PhD student, he needed to go through those archives as part of his PhD thesis, and he was not allowed to. So he actually had to move to Holland to study the documents in Holland, because in Brazil, like, it was off limits to him. The museum hours in the north of Brazil are very complicated. So every time you need to go to a museum and talk to people or take pictures, it's very difficult to get in. But I met some wonderful historians, and thank you to my aunt, Maria Luisa Tucci Carneiro, who is a famous historian in Brazil, who has studied the history of the Jews, Dr. Bruno Miranda and Jacques Ribbenboim, who were wonderful to me. And I like to say, when you do connect with people in Brazil, they're wonderful and they treat you like family. Also, another problem in Brazil is that they are pretty proud of the story, and sometimes exaggerate the what the history actually was. And this is a cover of a book printed in Brazil, and it says the victorious saga of the Jews of Recife, from Spain to the founding of New York. So they sort of take credit for the founding of New York, and that's not exactly true. And the researchers and the people that I contacted in Holland were wonderful. They respond to emails very quickly. They're very organized. The archives of the West India documents and online are amazing. And the only problem is that a lot of those websites are in Dutch, or the documents are in Dutch, so it's hard to translate them unless you have a cool friend like Ton, who helps you out. And thank you also to Julie Martin-Cohen at the museum, in the Jewish Museum in Holland, and Jaap Jacobs, who is a historian who had a lot of patience with me and my questions. And in the US, the standard for writing children's books, like, a lot of people don't know that, but like, it's actually higher, it's a higher standard to write a nonfiction picture book in the United States than it is to write an adult book, because the truth has to be really true, otherwise you're telling children lies. And it's also like my credibility with the historians here wasn't very high. I was just sort of a nobody, and I had a different theory about things, and they were very dubious of me and my intentions. But we do have excellent support groups for writers of children's books here in the United States, the SCBWI, and they helped me through this. And I also want to say thank you to Toya Dubin, who is an archivist and a volunteer at the New Amsterdam History Center, because anytime I thought, like, I can't do this, nobody's going to believe me, everybody's going to think that this is BS. And she was like, no, you have an opinion. It's a very valid one, and you need to go on, and your voice needs to be heard. So thank you for that. I'm just going to say here that I had an aha moment that gave me a lot of strength to write this book. And it was between me and a painter called Gordon Miller, who's the one who painted the two ships. And I told him that I'm considered a Levy heretic here. And he said, first of all, I love history heretics. They sometimes knock the smug off the experts, or at least make them defend their thesis. And I do remember that Leo Hershkowitz, who is a very famous authority on Asser, found new information in the middle of our discussions and completely changed his mind about some of the story. So anyway, that's just to say that it was a lot writing this book, and it was difficult, but I loved every second of it. I'm so grateful I did it. I'm so grateful that people will be reading and hearing about this amazing story that happened. And we don't know all the facts, but what we know is just incredible. And that's the end, fim in Portuguese. And that's me and my daughter testing out how the passengers of the 23 passengers lived on their ship. This is what this is a replica of a 17th century ship in Holland. So this is most likely what it looked like. And I would be so happy to answer any questions or any comments.
Yes. Thank you for your very interesting talk. It's amazing to see all those beautiful images you found to go with this. And the story in itself is very interesting. And I would like to ask something about Solomon Peterson.
Yeah,
That's a very Dutch sounding name. How do you know that he was Jewish?
So Solomon Peterson appears in that first lawsuit with Jacques de la Motte as being the attorney for the Jews, and they say in that lawsuit that he was a Jew.
Okay.
Yes, and I know that you found something out. I think he's like the first Jew in America to like marry a non-Jew. Like you found some information on that, right?
That makes it extra intriguing. If he married a non-Jew, he himself may have been a non-Jew.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe someone in the 19th century wrote up all these archives of New York, the minute books of Stuyvesant and this council, and thought, well, he defended the Jews, he must have been a Jew. Something like that. But I have no access to the original minutes, alas. So I can't check. Any questions from
well, first of all, I can see that Rachel is asking what ages is the book geared to, and can she buy it on Amazon? Daniela, before you answer, can I just say it's absolutely wonderful to find a book on Sephardim which actually deals with Sephardim as Sephardim rather than as some sort of fantasy figures in somebody else's imagination. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. So can you repeat that question again?
What age group is the book for, and is it available on Amazon?
Yes, it's available on Amazon. Yeah, here's I'm holding it up for you, and you can see that it's actually written in fonts that dyslexic people can read also. And there's a lot of images in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So it's and all of these images have information that is historical information. So it's written for the middle school audience mainly, but it's that's just because the language is very accessible, and when you write for children, you have to write very interestingly, otherwise they will put the book down. And so it's good for middle school kids, but
Can you define what middle school means?
Middle school is like ages, I would say like 10 to, 14, 15, something like that. But you can certainly read it as an adult. And, a lot of my adult friends have read it and found it super interesting. It's just written because it's written in a diary form. So, kids, it's not so dry, for kids, but adults can certainly read it too.
Okay, Stacey is asking the name of the first cemetery, if you could tell us that again.
Okay, so the cemetery that I show the pictures for is the Chatham Square Cemetery. Chatham is C-H-A-T-H-A-M, Chatham Square Cemetery.
It's a name from a naval dockyard in England.
It's also the Shearith, Israel, Portuguese, Spanish synagogue cemetery. And it's not actually the very first cemetery. The very first one was never found, and it was a small plot. And this was the actual second cemetery, but it was like right after the first one was. Yeah, it's in Chinatown in New York. And when things get okay, you can visit Shearith, Israel, and Zachary Edinger, who is that person who was, I showed a picture of inside the synagogue. He'll give you a tour of the cemetery if you'd like. There are some really interesting people who are buried there too.
Thank you. Dolce and Carol ask very similar questions. Is there a list of the names of the 23 people who were on the first journey? And also Carol is saying Jews have been in Jamaica since 1494. Well, maybe. Is there a roster of passengers who traveled from Brazil to Jamaica and then to New Amsterdam?
Sadly, no, and the only reason we know their names is because of those lawsuits between the passengers and Jacques de la Motte. So the ones that he names in the lawsuit are the ones that we know who they were. So there's a couple of other ones who were named, their last names were Israel, and they were actually sent to debtor's prison until the captain was repaid. So there was Ricky Nunes, there was Moses Ambrosius. There's a list of about 5 or 6 people, if I recall, that were named in the lawsuits who we know were on that ship.
We know who was arrested in Jamaica.
Do you think there's any other archives floating around that we haven't thought of? I mean, I'm wondering if the Catholic Church in Pernambuco maybe has inherited some records that nobody knows about, or is that just fanciful?
I don't know of anything. My instinct is to say that's fanciful because, and you know, Brazil doesn't have like, it's not, there are just not that many things that were kept, and the museums are in bad conditions usually. So I don't know how to answer.
Northeast is not particularly good for preservation of documents. I wouldn't have thought the weather.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
As like everybody else, my ancestors were all kicked out. But I also note that, firstly, I know what some of them were up to. I'd like to know what their work and social contexts were when they travelled, what they were doing. Did they bring servants with them, or people of different classes travelling across? And how did they handle that, and how was that handled? And why did some of them go back? What was going on when people went back and then came away again and went back to Spain or Portugal or Holland? What was actually going on?
Now,
And converting and unconverting and all of that. What was the environment within which they did that?
are you talking about when they left Brazil? Or are you talking about the ones who were?
When they left Holland, when they left Belgium and Holland, when they came to Brazil. But looking at the history of my family, who were kicked out of Spain via Portugal, that some of them went back in an unexpected. It was unexpected to me, because although they left, some went back and some came out again. Some converted, some didn't convert. And so it just strikes me that the issues around whether you convert, whether you marry somebody who's not Jewish. You go back into the English Middle Ages, there were Jews helping to run the country and marrying in and out of the royal families intermittently. So what was the sort of socio-political and social environment that they were living in? Because the sort of rules that one assumes about all of that seem to be different. So what were they doing? What jobs were they doing? And what kind of life were they actually living, as opposed to just going to somewhere?
How many years do you have?
Not many, I'm afraid.
David, do you want to answer that, or like, because you guys are experts on that, if you want to answer, that's fine.
I can have a go for that one. The Jews in Dutch Brazil did a lot of trading. Sugar was produced, and for the Jews that bought the sugar, shipped it to Holland, sold it there.
Right.
In Holland there were sugar factories which turned the raw sugar into refined sugar that was a luxury good and ruined everyone's teeth in the rest of the history. But Jews in Brazil also worked as brokers to facilitate trade between others, and they also traded in slaves, I'm afraid.
I wondered, yes.
There were a lot of plantations, and for those plantations, a lot of slaves were needed. They came from West Africa, primarily Angola and Guinea, and they were shipped by Dutch captains. And received, they were sold on the slave market. And there, everyone participated, not only the Jews, also the Dutch Protestants, the Portuguese Catholics, and in the end, it were mostly Portuguese plantation owners that had jobs for these slaves.
Yeah, it's sad to say that, not all of the Jews necessarily had slaves, but some of them did. Some of them participated in the trading, and some of them didn't. There are Dutch West India Company documents that show like who had what, who sold what. So you can see like it wasn't everybody, but it was definitely, sadly,
but they were normal. They were part of the ruling class and part of the non-ruling classes at the time. They behaved like other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there were rich and poor. If I can just throw something in, because as a family, I'm quite interested in the Sarajevo de Mendonça, who were living in Portuguese, in Pernambuco, in Portuguese Brazil, before the Dutch arrived as Catholics. When the Dutch were there, they seemed to have just sort of melded in, and they seemed to have some sort of Jewish relatives. And then at the end, they fought with the Portuguese to kick the Dutch out, and of course managed to keep their estates. Can you hear me? It's saying my internet is unstable.
It's fine.
Okay, great. So and I think that, there were richer and there were poor, as anywhere else. But we are learning. We are learning. Which is your family? I'm just curious.
Who are you asking?
You.
Me?
Yes.
Abulafia.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a big family. So yeah.
There's another one here as well. Bernard Miller is also one. He's somewhere along the line of pictures.
Okay, I won't stop playing.
We went to Manchester in 1921, and my mother was born there, and that's how that side of my family.
Is
the other
that
side of the
Greek,
Ashkenazi,
Turkish, Egyptian, or
Spanish Egyptian?
Yeah. Okay, yes, and
Arabic speaking.
Yeah.
Mother's hatters.
I first of all would like to congratulate Danielle for the interesting work she has done. I know the work Tanya Kaufman has done also for children, but this is not immigrant from Recife to the New Amsterdam, but the comers or the newcomers to Recife. But that's very interesting that you think about the new generation. So congratulations for that.
Yes.
And my question is about the materials they worked, and we talk about the selling of slaves and that. I'm very interested in the Pau do Brasil, if Jewish were or conversos were involved in the, in the mercantilism of these materials.
Yes. Yeah, sadly.
We talk only of sugar. But the Pau do Brasil was very important in that time.
The what of Brazil?
Oh,
Pau de Brazil.
Pau de Brazil.
That's correct. So Brazil, just to give it a context, Brazil, the country is named after a tree that's called pau Brasil. And the word Brasil comes from the word brasa, which means coal, like a live coal,
Like
like
gold.
orange, red, and ember, yes. And that tree, which I believe is almost extinct now, was of a reddish color, and it was very valuable, and it was traded between Europe and the Americas and also the Caribbean. I think every time a ship came and went, they would load it with pau Brasil and any of the other items from Brazil, such a rich country with so many resources. So yes, besides the sugar, there were other things, yeah. And also, like, thank you to the Dutch who colonized Brazil, because they brought in amazing painters and writers and scientists who studied the plants and the animals, and who have some of the earliest images of what Brazil looked like back then, because the Portuguese were not so into that. Was to say.
Yes, many pictures and illustrations.
Yes.
Wonderful ones.
Bernard, you are unmuted if you are wanting to ask a question.
Okay, first of all, can I thank Daniela? I think the presentation was brilliant. I have to get a copy of the book. You have solved my problem for what do I give my great niece who's having a bat mitzvah next year. Because last year I gave her brother for his bar mitzvah a series of about Jewish pirates of the Caribbean, some of which are of pretty dubious historical importance. But I have a question that is coming across to the Americas from a different quarter, and it is some of my Sephardic ancestors who moved from Hamburg to Denmark and then were sent by the King of Denmark, one of them as governor of what was then the Danish West Indies, is now the US Virgin Islands, and that was slightly earlier. And I'm wondering what interactions there were. What I do know from the bits that I have been able to read from some more reliable sources and even some of the less, is that there were Jewish pirates in the Caribbean, and that this particular relative, who was sent under the name of Gabriel Milan, but he had half a dozen other names, was supposed to be tasked by the Danish royal family to stop the piracy in those islands. But there was a lot of movement between there and the American mainland. And I wondered whether or not your book or your research touches on any of that.
So I would say maybe David, if you can unmute Ainsley, he might be able to answer that question really nicely.
Okay.
So one of our viewers here is Ainsley Cohen Enriquez, and he's a direct descendant of the Cohen Enriquezes who were in Jamaica in the 1600s, and also, you know, one of the people who runs the synagogue in Jamaica. He will have more information on that than I do.
Ainsley is unmuted if you want to.
Unmuted. My wife will be happy to put it back. No, I want to first of all congratulate you, Ton and David, because these programs are extraordinarily interesting and very, very important. And Daniela, I've read your book more than once. It is wonderful.
Okay.
I made the comment. As far as the Pirates of the Caribbean, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean are concerned, I think it's a more appropriate statement to say that there were Jews with the pirates in the Caribbean rather than Pirates of the Caribbean. Ed Kritzler, who wrote the book, happened to have written a lot of it in my house. So I had significant conversations, and I don't think I want to sully his name by stating anything other than the facts that there were Jews who were pirates in the Caribbean.
Can I just say on that, I'm using a different source for myself, which is Haring, who did a thesis in the late 1890s and went on to become a professor at Oxford University and has an award named after him, who I think is more credible than Kritzler, but I'm not criticizing Kritzler.
Kritzler was trying to sell a book, and I think he did quite well with it.
Yeah, whereas Haring wasn't. He was just writing a thesis that became a book.
some of the problems, of course, is in fact, and I made a written comment that there is a possibility, distant possibility, that the list of the people who came on the Catherine on the Falcon to Jamaica, or who left on the St. Catherine, may have been in the Spanish records. But where these are is a very important, is a non we don't know. They could be in Cuba, or they could be in Spain. But you know, the English captured Jamaica a year after less than a year after the St. Catherine sailed. So anything is possible. But that would be the only last place where I think we could find a list of those names.
That would be so.
Or they could be lost.
Yes.
I don't think the English had much
They had no concern.
value to Spanish archives.
No, they had no interest in the Spanish archives.
Yes.
But I think there are some archives in Denmark, in the Royal Library, which have some information.
Yes, but about Jamaica?
About Jamaica, no. I don't know, but about the Caribbean in general, because they had possessions in the Caribbean at that time, and they had a lot of administration sort of set up around them. Well, a lot. They had some administration set up around them. It was of fairly dubious quality, the administration, but that's another set of stories.
Since 1 year, I'm looking to find some documents on the immigration of Italian Jews, and namely Tuscan Jews, from Livorno to Brazil and other New Indians. By sure, there was an attempt of the Medici family to settle some Jews in the New Indian. Do you ever came across to Livorno Jews, or maybe Italian Jews in your researches? Because some of the names you quoted and some of the names I found in the cemetery of Pernambuco, those lists which have been published, are by sure Italian. But I don't understand if they are directly from Tuscany, or maybe they went in Amsterdam, on Holland, and then in Brazil. Do you ever found traces of Italian Jews?
I personally don't know. I don't. Does anybody here? Maybe people in Brazil who might.
I know there are some stories about Livornese Jews settling on Curaçao and in other places.
Yeah.
But these stories don't mention names, and I have not been able to find sources in the archives about these Livornese. But if they, well, I bet that they might be in Dutch archives, because if they went to Curaçao, they had to come through Amsterdam.
What I can do, Leonardo, right? Is it Bernardo?
Yeah. Leonardo, yes.
Oh, Leonardo, okay. What I can do is go through some of my Brazilian sources that I have here that have names. I have a biographical dictionary, and it says, sometimes it says their origin, and sometimes it has a little bit of their story, because they were eventually caught by the Inquisition, and then they say where they're originally from. So I can look to see if I can find any that are Italian. And
it could be very interesting to find maybe how to say the same family in Tuscany who came, because by sure there was a project of settlements of Tuscan Jews in Brazil. I don't know where, and our Livorno, you know, was a freedom town, so indeed they were free also to come back also and trade with America.
right, it's very interesting.
If I'm not mistaken, not Brazil, but I think in the Auto de Fe in Mexico in 1640s, 1650s, if I'm not mistaken, there were connections to maybe Pisa and other places within Tuscany, but that's presumably before Livorno was established as a Jewish center.